Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control.
As an immigrant, I came here when I was 6 from the Soviet Union, from Odessa, Ukraine. And if schools had shut down when I came here and when I was acquiring the language, when my parents were struggling, my father was a plumber and was working in incinerators and was, out of the house all day. My mother's a bookkeeper commuting to Manhattan, and that's what we needed. That was our livelihood. And it was just me, like in our tiny apartment. If I had been shut in that apartment for months and months and months and not been able to go to first grade, I don't think I'd be here speaking to you right now.
Natalya Murakhver joins me on today's episode to talk about her new documentary, 15 Days, The Real Story of America's Pandemic School Closures, and the importance of preserving the true narrative of America's disastrous COVID-era policy decisions. Natalya and I talk about teachers' unions' outsized role in shaping the policy and narrative during and after the closures. We cover the disruptive policy's significant impacts on children's academic outcomes, engagement with school, future opportunities, mental health, and social development. And Natalya explains why we must prevent this harmful chapter in our nation's history from being rewritten. Natalya's personal experiences as a Soviet immigrant and mother fueled her commitment to advocating for children's education. She was a leader in the open schools movement, the founder of Urgency of Normal, and as she explains during our conversation, she convened esteemed medical experts from across the country to create and communicate a toolkit to convince school districts to reopen schools. 15 Days has been released on X. Please check it out and consider scheduling a screening in your community. Natalya Murakhver, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you so much, Ginny. It's great to see you.
You've created a documentary, 15 Days, The Real Story of America's Pandemic School Closures. Why is it important to document what happened during the COVID era?
I think it's incredibly important to keep the history and the records available to everyone and to make sure that the story is not rewritten and that the people who did this to our kids don't get to set the narrative, because that would be handing a victory to them. And realistically, this is our children's stories. I have not seen anyone really portray the voices of the children and the parents and the people who experienced this. I mean, there are a lot of people who spoke for them, but here they speak for themselves.
So when you say people are rewriting what happened, rewriting history, are there particular entities, particular individuals or groups who you see that doing that more than others?
Based on what we've uncovered, it does seem like the narrative was being set by the teachers' unions, who saw it as an opportunity. They saw COVID, the pandemic, as an opportunity for a reset, for societal change. And Randi Weingarten pretty much said that in March 2020. We just weren't listening.
Yeah, when you say Randi Weingarten, we do talk about the teachers' unions here, and we talk about her. She's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, which is a misnomer because it's actually this conglomeration of a bunch of different unions. Only one of maybe 6 happened to be K-12 teachers, but she definitely had an outsized role during the COVID closures, and I will explore that a little bit more. I think some people might push back on folks like us who are still talking about this, still wanting to document it, still wanting to ensure that people understand the results of what happened during COVID closures. What would you say to them as to why this is so essential that we keep the conversation going?
Well, I mean, No King's Day just happened. Randi Weingarten was one of the chief organizers of that. When we watched hours and hours of interviews with her and podcasts, she talked about the fact that all of the social justice initiatives were all the same thing. There was a podcast in which she said environmental justice is racial justice, is social justice, is gender justice. I mean, everything that's happening now, it's a very contemporary story. It's not the past. COVID was just one stage.
One thing that I've noticed in my years working in K-12 education policy is that the system just generally waits for the troublesome or vocal parents to move on through. And so that's something that could have happened as a result of the COVID era kids graduating, moving on. And then the parents who fought to get schools open again, who fought to expose the harm, would be moving on. I feel really strongly that we can't just let the parents graduate and the system continue as is without consequence for what happened. And so I'm so thankful that you've created this documentary again, 15 days. The real story of America's pandemic school closures. 15 days, as far as the closures, that was not the case in the areas where you and I live. And in many areas across the country, 15 days became what, like a year, sometimes close to 2 years when you're talking about going back to quote unquote normal?
Yeah, I mean, you heard Bill Gates talking about reimagining education. I mean, it was an opportunity and a real confluence of factors. I mean, ed tech really saw this as an opportunity to usher in technology that had never been seen before in a classroom. Kids were pushed onto phones. We had the schools closed to kids for a while, and parents were fighting to get the kids back inside. But my whole thing is, hold on a second. When we got the kids back inside, suddenly parents were the ones who were being locked out. We couldn't both go back into the building together. In New York, for instance, which is where I live, we had vaccine mandates for parents. Every obstacle was put into place to make sure that these kids, when they went back into those classrooms, when they went back into those buildings, those parent teacher associations, they were kind of ruptured, right? I mean, parents who tried to speak at school board meetings were silenced, and worse, they were called domestic terrorists, as actual terrorism is happening in this country. Kids were being indoctrinated. I mean, I used to hate that term. I used to say, oh my God, that's such like a charged term. We really shouldn't use it. But I don't know what other term fits it better. When parents are separated from kids, when the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the country, run by Becky Pringle, says they are our kids, they're not your kids. When President Biden says they're all our children, and the doors of the school buildings are closed to parents, and parents are being treated like criminals instead of their children's best allies, this is a real reimagining of education. And I have to say, if we had heard Randy Weingarten talk about it in March 2020, and it wasn't just Randy, it was a lot of different actors on the left, environmental groups, Jane Fonda, shocking, shocking stuff. Like, had no idea that this was happening. They put it on YouTube. So it was there if somebody was looking. We weren't looking. We didn't know. We were sanitizing our groceries. But yes, this has been the greatest, rupture to family life and education in this country, and schools never truly reopened. Our public schools in New York City are, decrepit. They spend more money than any other school district. They have terrible results. People are fleeing to charters, private parochials, out of the city, out of the country. The 15 days is still going.
Oh, good point. I was just thinking that the 15 days to slow the spread, as far as like just, a couple weeks, we'll close the schools, then we'll open back up, became a significantly longer period till the school doors opened again. But I hear what you're saying. They opened, but things did not go back to quote unquote normal by any stretch of the imagination. I think some people who live in more rational parts of the country, so Florida, for example, a state where things open back up, would be shocked to hear you saying that parent-teacher meetings did not resume, that there were these restrictions put on parents to even enter the building, to interact directly, to see what's going on in their classroom. I'm sure that the parents in Florida were just heading back to volunteer in the schools again, to meet directly with their teachers. So that, I think, is another reason that a product like this, a documentary like this, is important, because there were such discrepancies across the country. Everybody needs to know what happened, and everybody needs to be vigilant to make sure it doesn't happen again.
They used safetyism, like,
Yeah.
you're clean, you're dirty, you're vaccinated, you're not.
You talk about out of abundance of caution in the trailer that pops up, and then our pal David Zweig has the book that he's written on that he entitled "An Abundance of Caution: American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions." So I'd imagine he's got the book version, and then you've got the documentary version that lays out the fact that there wasn't a lot of real scientific evidence for the closures in the first place. Can you talk a little bit about your work during the closures to expose that fact?
Well, at first I was sanitizing my groceries, and my husband, who at the time was just about to turn 50, remembers not so fondly that I wouldn't even allow him out of the building. I was just like, you can't leave the house. Like, you're going to die. Like, we're being told you're going to die. But what I realized, my kids were like 5 and 9 at the time. I also understood how valuable socialization and normalcy was for kids, that the calculus is completely different. And it was pretty clear pretty early on in Europe and even in Asia, the kids were not in danger, that mostly, it was a mild virus that would pass. And so by September, October 2020 in New York City, we were being promised that schools were going to reopen. And we had arguably the worst mayor in New York City history, Bill de Blasio. Terrible, terrible mayor. I think universally hated by the left and the right. And to his credit, he did make good on his promise. And by the end of September, a few weeks late, he did manage to open schools in New York City, which was a huge triumph. But there was this looming like 5% transmission threshold that was kind of over us. And we knew that with this really onerous transmission threshold, which the unions, of course, demanded because they wanted to reclose schools. So he was up against the unions, whether he was in their pockets, whatever. But I mean, he was still had to work with them, and they had to get the teachers into the buildings. And so we knew that it was just a matter of time before things closed again, and also knew that it was looking like it was a political stunt. This was no longer a question of safety. We knew that teachers were young. They were largely the safest demographic outside of kids to be in classrooms. So what gives? So we started organizing rallies and petitions. November 2020, we had our very first rally, and then a few more after that. But they didn't really work, and schools closed again anyway. They closed, I think, in at the end of November, and so I had to figure out, like, okay, well, like peaceful protests, like, talking to the media doesn't really work. And by the way, the only media outlets that showed up after, a few rallies were the conservative ones. So I found myself as a New York City Democrat going, I don't know, should I talk to the New York Post? Should I appear on Fox? And I remember going, I don't want to be looked at as a right winger. But at the same time, if the New York Times doesn't want to talk to us, if, ABC News is not interested in covering this story, I better talk to whoever will listen. And so I did that. That was some of the stuff that I was starting to do. Some others wouldn't do it. They wouldn't even give those conservative outlets the time of day. But I thought that was a missed opportunity. We should talk to everyone. But as time progressed and the middle and high schools did not reopen, and you could see how much these kids were suffering, I decided to organize a lawsuit. And so I begged a lawyer named Jim Mermiguez, who was known as like the anti-lockdown lawyer at that point. He was based in Long Island. He had sued Cuomo to reopen bars, strip clubs, and gyms. Was incredibly successful. And I begged and begged and begged him to take the case because lawyers across the country wouldn't take these school reopening cases. And what triggered him finally was when I texted him and said, by the way, kids are doing Zoom in a room. And he was like, what's Zoom in a room? And I said, Zoom in a room means that these middle and high schoolers are sitting in a classroom separated by 6 to 8 feet apart with masks on, staring into screens while their teachers are teaching them from other rooms. And he was like, how could this be? This can't be true. And I sent him some articles, and he said, I'll take the case.
These are the things that people in rational parts of the country, again, might not realize were happening. There might be some sort of documentation. Well, this school district reopened. No, it didn't. That's not a fully functioned reopen school. Oh, well, this school was providing online education during the various COVID surges. No, it wasn't. The students had to click around, or their parents had to click around and try to find lessons to complete. There wasn't like full online instruction happening in most places. So definitely important to remind people that that wasn't real instruction, that reopening was not actual reopening in many cases. So there was a lawsuit. Like, any success with that?
Well, we filed it. It was supposed to be like an urgent injunction, Article 78. I can't remember exactly, but Jim had assured me that once we filed it, it would be heard within 2 weeks. So this was April 2021. We had like a rolling roster of plaintiffs. I can't even tell you how many plaintiffs we had. People were coming forward and saying, I'll sign on, I'll sign on. My kid
Okay.
is dying in remote. And so we filed it. And of course, the courts were all virtual at the time. There was no real response and there was no court date, nothing. They stalled the hearing until July 2021 after the schools had closed. Although, schools had reopened for elementary school kids, but I don't know if you want to talk about how those kids were treated and how they had to sit in one line at lunchtime, stare at the wall and pull down their masks and take bites and not talk to each other because God forbid they should spread the coronavirus to each other. I
Didn't
mean,
kids have to sit outside in New York winters as
yeah.
well? Like
My
little
kids sat
kids?
outside, but you know what? They preferred to sit outside than sitting in a lineup in the lunchroom with their masks on and being treated like, worse than Rikers Island. I mean, that's how they couldn't they were masked in the classrooms too. My kindergartner, my then fourth grader, fifth grader, I can't remember, but they had to go outside of the classroom to take a sip of water. And if it was more than one child, they had to stand like, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet apart. Think about what that teaches that child about connectedness and community and their peers. They're viral vectors. That's what Andy Slavitt, who was an Obama, I think, appointee, said. He called the kids viral vectors like mosquitoes. And that's exactly how the union portrayed them in the narrative to the teachers, to everyone, and to the kids themselves.
We need to talk a little bit more about the union role in this, not just in New York, but around the country. Your trailer features a quote from union boss Randy Weingarten: "Use this for the society we want to see." And we saw that not just from Randy. Sometimes we pay too much attention to her. We saw that from the local union leaders too. For example, the LA union leader and the demands that they put on the school district in order for the union to agree with reopening. Do you expose any of those kinds of examples?
Yeah, I mean, Chicago Teachers Union, is there anyone, more nefarious than that? The Chicago Teachers Unions famously tweeted and deleted, but there are records anyway, that school reopening was rooted in misogyny and I can't remember, bigotry and hate or something like that. And all the while, and this is in our film, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union, one of them was in Puerto Rico, sunbathing and saying, "Oh, we have to stay remote for safety." And Stephanie Edmonds, who was my partner on this film from the very beginning, she was a teacher in the Bronx public schools. She refused to get vaccinated when they had the vaccine mandate for teachers. And so she left and, was a single mom. And I saw she had some tech skills, was very talented on Instagram. So she and I started working together and eventually made this film. She talks about the fact that most of the teachers, they felt okay going back, but they were being told that they're not safe. And so they ended up going on vacations and teaching remotely in their pajamas from, Curacao. So yes, we definitely do. The other thing is that in an article back in like 2021, and I quote this daily, Cecily Myart Cruz, the head of UTLA, the LA Teachers Unions, just brushed off the fact that there was lost learning and that kids were going to fall behind. And she said something to the effect of, "It doesn't matter that our babies don't know their timetables. They know the difference between a riot and a coup." That's the important thing to learn in school, I guess.
Natalia, it makes me so angry remembering that people were saying that, and then the closures continued.
Mhm.
Or the semi-opening continue. Like, how could we not all be outraged and motivated to act? It wasn't just the unions in my area. Our local superintendent was saying at school board meetings, we need to get away from that concept of learning loss. Remember when that became a talking point in the
Yes.
education system? How insane, how absolutely insane that instead of being incredibly concerned about the outcomes of these closures and everything that was happening to kids, that we're going to tell people to not worry that students are no longer learning,
And
that we have to get
meanwhile,
away
they
from that.
were abusing open schools parents and calling us white supremacists and saying that we just wanted babysitters.
Right, right. Be quiet. And we're going to call you names if you're not quiet, and we're going to, disparage you.
Randy does talk about how important it is to seize the narrative. They had this whole playbook. And what they did was, and it was brilliant. I mean, it was absolutely brilliant. They said to the Black community, you're not safe. Your kids are not safe. They're going to die in the schools, as though the virus discriminates based on color. I mean, it's the definition of racism. They told the Black and brown community, don't go back. They're not going to be able to keep you safe. By the way, they are the unions, right? Like, we're not going to keep you safe, or your kids are going to die. So don't go back. Then they went to the teachers, who, as Scott Atlas in our film says, teachers are the youngest demographic. If anything, schools were safer than the rest of society. And they said to the teachers, you are not safe. We cannot keep you safe. Don't go back. And then then they had the spokespeople on the teacher side and the spokespeople on the Black people side, because they had all been manipulated by the same nefarious entities. And the teachers were like, we don't want to go back. We don't want to die for the DOE. And the Black community is like, you're not going to keep our children safe. So you're racist if you want to, send our kids to die. We're not going to do that either. And so you had the teachers unions going, well, it's not us. Like, we have to be equitable. Like, our members don't want to go back, and neither does the Black community. So we're just the messengers. We're just trying to be equitable.
And now we have achievement gaps that are historically heartbreaking. And we have fallout, particularly when it comes to academics, among lower income students. The highest income students, the highest performing students, are fine when you look at test results. And then everybody else is not. And then the lowest performing, the lowest income students particularly were hit hard by this. So absolute inequity when it came to school closures. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences. That's something that you are definitely exposing with this film, by telling the parents and the students' stories. There's a quote from a student saying, teachers just didn't care. So we've talked about how online schooling did not provide a real education. It sounds like it really did deeply impact students and break that connection that they would have had, that trust that they would have had of teachers and of school.
And the amount of abuse that went on. I mean, teachers are mandated reporters. That's the person that the student comes to if there's abuse in the home. Back when we first launched Restore Childhood, a teacher in California had written a story for us on our Substack about how, when she was a young teacher, she noticed that a child was stealing after school snacks and eating them clandestinely. And she watched the child for a while and realized that there may be, hunger issues and other issues, and found out that the stepmother had been abusing this child and his brother. And the father was in the Navy or something and didn't know. And so she had the opportunity to intervene and to save this child and his brother, notify the father, and the stepmother was removed from the picture, and the child is now an adult and has written to her and said, thank you. If it hadn't been for you, I don't know what would have happened to me and my brother. And I've heard that story repeated many times in different variations. And if you think about all those children who didn't have anyone to turn to, I mean, I have a friend who teaches ballroom dancing, and she was forced to do it on Zoom in New York City at the time. And I remember the agony she felt. She wanted to be in the classroom with her teachers, with her students. It was dance. But I remember at one point she saw a child where she thought, he looked like he had a bruise, and he would turn off his camera. And the agony she felt about what to do in that situation, because her superiors at the vendor for the DOE would say, well, this is none of our business. Like, there are so many kids who were just left behind and completely abandoned. I mean, those are the worst case scenarios. But, even the neglect, I mean, in our film, Bam, Garrett Morgan, who lost an opportunity at a football scholarship and gained a lot of weight and is now in a LaGuardia Community College and its student body president. He's doing pretty well. I mean, he's a very successful, smart, self-driven kid, but he talks about what it was like to be abandoned by the schools. And he said you could feel the disconnect. I could leave the room, go get a sandwich, come back, and nothing. I was never missed. Like, these kids were out of sight. They were never missed. There was nobody watching them. And that is horrible. I mean, Monica Gandhi, who is an infectious disease expert at UCSF in San Francisco, was one of the early open schools advocates. And she talks about the contrast between how the progressive cities handled the Spanish flu, which was more dangerous for kids back in 1917, 18. And the progressive cities were the ones that kept the schools open because they knew that these millions of kids in these big cities depended on the schools for everything, for their lifeline.
The progressive cities, and people might not realize this, people might have forgotten, they also closed the playgrounds. You're talking about just a community-wide abandonment of children, of children's needs. And of course, there's going to be significant fallout. So we've talked a little bit about the academic fallout, about safety issues. We've talked about the fact that students' trajectories were impacted if they no longer were playing sports and can no longer be recruited. Psychological harm got a lot of attention at the time. I wonder if we're forgetting already just how much emergency room visits spiked. I mean,
And,
this
we-
was
and I think they had
real
closed
harm.
12 children's hospitals, like the mental wards for children, which are very different than adults. And I remember there was a huge backlog, like parents with kids with mental health issues. They had nowhere to go.
Right. Right, right. And no hope. I mean, in New York, I guess there was that the various versions of reopening in an area like mine, Northern Virginia, or my district specifically. There were closures for a full year. And then at the end of the 2020-21 school year, some students could come back 2 days a week. That's not a real reopening. That's not a real school experience. Also, it's been a year. And then we haven't even talked about the disruptions that quarantine policies caused. So this did drag on as students were continued to be viewed as viral vectors. And if there was any whiff of you sat next to somebody who tested positive for COVID, you're out for 2 weeks. I mean, that kind of disruption of learning that continued on for another year or so was an incredibly harmful psychologically, academically, and as far as the ability to participate in activities and how that impacted their trajectory.
You know what was open at the time? Those online communities. The trans community was very, very open while the schools were closed. And I sat in a room with parents yesterday talking about some of the issues that their kids have encountered over the course of the past few years. And most of them it was an event that was talking about, gender and kids who are transitioning and kind of a support place. I personally don't have such a story. I'm very fortunate, but I know way too many parents who are just lost still trying to rescue their kids from gender ideology. And without exception, every single parent who spoke about what happened to their kids who are now like 20 or high teens said that they found community online when schools were closed and they were welcomed in and they haven't been able to extricate them. So, what were the unions doing? Where were they pushing the kids? I do lay this at the feet of the unions because they're still pushing all of this stuff. So this is very much not the past.
Not the past. Consequences continue and will continue for these students their whole lives, whether you're talking about embracing an identity that leads to lifelong harm and irreversible damage, whether you're talking about academic fallout. 22% of 12th graders are proficient in math, according to the most recent Nations Report Card results. 35% are proficient in reading. And when you look at the math scores, 45% of students who were tested, these were 12th graders, don't even reach the basic level. So, sure, maybe they won't go on to college, but regardless of what they go on to, we have robbed them of basic math skills. And there's a high percentage of students who don't have basic reading skills. We've robbed them of the ability to read as they should be able to. So this that's going to impact them for life. I can't understand why there would be apathy about what happened during the closures and why there wouldn't be an interest or a passion for ensuring that it never happens again. And that's why your film is so important, because we do get caught up in whatever the outrage is of the day. We get caught up in whatever it is that on our to-do list of the day, but we have to take a look at what happened, who caused it, and make sure we're not going to do it again. Are there any other stories that you featured in this film that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I think many of your listeners are probably familiar with what happened to Jay Bhattacharya and Scott Atlas and doctors who spoke out and tried to challenge the narrative. I mean, in our film, those doctors kind of go through the same trajectory as the parents, right? Like they're also often parents. Jay had three children who were suffering as well during the pandemic. And as a doctor, he and a researcher, he said, "Oh, I guess there's the naive Jay at the beginning saying, I'm just going to look at the research and see if the infection fatality rate, which is what they were pushing, is really as high as they say it is. Is it really that dangerous of a virus?" And he did the research and found that, in fact, it was far lower. Scott Atlas, the same. They were at Stanford University at the time. And what happened instead was Jay got death threats. There was censure on Scott Atlas. They were treated like criminals. The Biden administration ordered the social media companies to censor them. Instead of listening to these common sense, world class researchers, we had the federal government calling them fringe epidemiologists to completely discredit their views. Why? Why was ideology pushed like that? It seemed like there was a narrative that they were struggling to keep hold of. And if it hadn't been for people like Jay Bhattacharya, Scott Atlas, Human Hamadi, the doctors that I worked with at Urgency of Normal, we may still be in a school closure and a partial lockdown. They just would not rest. These people refused to back down because they knew that whatever personal comforts they were sacrificing, it was worth it for society, because the forces on the other side were, the ones writing the book.
Can you talk a little bit more about your efforts with Urgency of Normal?
In 2021, I think probably at some point in early 2021, Randy Weingarten did an AFT roundtable with Eric Hartman and Michelle from Open Schools USA. There was an entity at the time called Open Schools USA. I don't think it exists anymore. And Brandy brought several of her experts. It was around the Virginia gubernatorial race around that time as well that year. And Eric and Michelle brought Jay Bhattacharya and Tracy Beth Hogue to talk about, they thought, well, we're going to come here in good faith and we're going to have a real open discussion and we're going to show them, we're going to prove to them, we have all the data, we've done the research, that actually opening schools and getting rid of all of these restrictions makes perfect sense, and other countries are doing it without any ill effects. So it was a very frustrating conversation because the two doctors that the teachers union brought were not researchers. They had no concept of the research. They really just had their idea, their ideology, and their talking points from the unions. Jay and Tracy trying really hard. I mean, if you know researchers, they don't have a lot of hubris. They're really just trying to understand, what does the data say? And they're presenting the data. It's being completely dismissed out of hand. So my daughters at the time were suffering quite a bit with mask mandates because they were in elementary school and their school had somewhat reopened. It was, alternate days or whatever it was, but it was better than nothing. And I had asked the open schools people, I said, how did you get Randy Weingarten to do this with you? And they said, we DM'd her on Twitter. So I was like, I can do that. So I did. And to her credit, she accepted my invitation, and she and I went out for a drink date on Marathon Sunday in November 2021 here in New York City. And I brought her a little bracelet that my 6-year-old then had made, and a little picture that said, I'm happier unmasked than I am masked. And I said to her, you know, I've read the papers. It looks like you have a hand in CDC guidance. I'm asking you as a mother who's seen how much the kids are suffering, will you please talk to the CDC and get them to drop all this mask guidance, all the vaccine mandates and stuff? And she said, if you give me a proposal, I will present it to the CDC. Just send me a proposal. And it was like such a audacious thing to say, like, who am I? I'm not a medical expert. I'm not any kind of expert. I'm just a mom. And what is my proposal? My proposal is get the kids back to normal. Anyway, we agreed that that's what I would do. And I went home and called Tracy Hogue and said, can we do a proposal? Like, what's the proposal? And Tracy said, I don't know. She's like, there's no evidence to support any of these policies because she's also a dual national between the US and Denmark. And she said in Denmark, kids are just back to normal. The proposal is take the masks off. Put them back into normal school. Anyway, we went back and forth for months trying to figure out what is the proposal for Randy Weingarten. Ultimately, it was a toolkit that a Bay Area virologist named Scott Balsitis had designed for his own school district in the Bay Area to try to get the schools to get the kids back to normal. It was a great toolkit. Tracy got behind it. She brought it to me. We brought on all these incredible experts, including people like Vinay Prasad, Eliza Holland. They were from all over the country. Carol Vidal in Maryland at Johns Hopkins, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and they all co-signed. And we did a Zoom. We released the toolkit with press releases. It was all grassroots. There was no money. It was me being up like 20 hours a day, my husband helping with the website, a friend here in New York designing the logo. Of course, later we were accused of having dark money, if only. I mean, that would have been amazing if I had had some dark money, but there was no money. The toolkit was very successful because parents from all over the country emailed us and said, thank you so much for finally collecting all of the data into something digestible that I could reproduce and share with my school board and really use evidence to argue for restoration of normalcy. So that's, we had thousands of doctors that co-signed around the country. It was a success. It was very stressful because there were also lots of hits on those doctors. They were being threatened. Lucy McBride, one of the doctors in the Virginia area, was doxxed. I mean, they did everything they could to silence them, but I think these doctors really knew that they had to speak out because there's nobody else.
People might not remember just how hard it was to speak up. And particularly if you're thinking about protecting your children, your children's relationships, your children's opportunities. The Facebook group in my area was so nasty because they wanted to keep any sort of dissent silent. It inspired a whole subset of parents who found each other on the community's Facebook group to create their own group. So we did all find each other, I suppose, whether it was through hashtag open schools on Twitter back in the day or through these subsets of rational parents who found each other while being bullied on the larger groups. But it was a kind of a lonely and hard time to speak up. So I'm thankful that you were out there leading the charge. What fueled that for you? I know you said that your children were suffering, but was there something else?
Well, first of all, as an immigrant, I came here when I was 6 from the Soviet Union, from Odessa, Ukraine. And if schools had shut down when I came here and when I was acquiring the language, when my parents were struggling, my father was a plumber and was working in incinerators and was, out of the house all day. My mother is a bookkeeper commuting to Manhattan, and that's what we needed. That was our livelihood. And it was just me, like in our tiny apartment. If I had been shut in that apartment for months and months and months and not been able to go to first grade, I don't think I'd be here speaking to you right now. So, I mean, that personal experience is one thing, but also just watching the kids, like seeing how important it was for them to see each other, to see each other's faces, and understanding child development. And as a mother, young parents spend a lot of time reading about child development. It was very clear that we were disrupting developmental milestones, and those things are not recoverable. You cannot recover them. You can maybe acquire those skills, but you're meant to develop those skills at certain windows. And I was deeply, deeply concerned that we were disrupting those developmental milestones and we'd have a generation of kids who couldn't cope. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. I mean, Scott Atlas just released an article with research about this generation, Gen Z, and, the blank stare, the low academic achievements. I mean, they're all like relying on AI. Like it's
Yeah.
terrifying. It's
Yeah.
terrifying. And no sense of objective reality. And those were things, that really deeply concerned me. And every time people said, "Oh, my kid's okay in remote." And I'm like, "But over how long? When will you know if your kid is okay?" Like to me, that was a ridiculous statement. Like my kids could be okay for a week, for 2 weeks, but like over time, also what was the message we were sending to them? That they weren't important, that outside was dangerous, that other people were vectors. These are all the wrong messages for a productive society and was destroying and continues to destroy American society.
Yeah. Natalya, how can people watch this very important movie, 15 Days, The Real Story of America's Pandemic School Closures?
It will be available for a minor payment on Vimeo, like a small fee to watch on Vimeo. And then in a few weeks, it will be on streaming channels, Amazon Prime, Google Play, and Apple TV. But that's about it. Takes a while before the aggregator gets it to all the streaming channels. So that'll probably take another month or so. And it's also available for screenings. That if you go to our website, 15daysfilm.com, you can sign up to host a screening. I think the best way to watch it is with other people. Honestly, like this should be watched communally and discussed. And we're going to be doing screenings around the country as well.
Fantastic. How can people follow your work outside of the 15 Days film?
They can follow it on Twitter at Restore Childhood. So it's missing an E. Restore Childhood. We have a Substack, Restore Childhood Substack. You could just Google it, or restorechildhood.com.
Well, Natalya, thank you for your commitment to protecting our children and their futures. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's great to talk to you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.